Ilara arrived with the last of the autumn winds, a season of endings that felt cruelly appropriate. She stood on the crest of a low, barren hill and watched as the man who drove the rickety truck unloaded her 2 trunks and a canvas sack onto the frozen ground. They were the sum total of her worldly possessions, the compressed artifacts of a life that had, only 3 months prior, been full of warmth and noise and the easy certainties of a shared future. Now all that remained was silence, the deed to this forgotten parcel of land clutched in her hand, and the hollow echo in her chest where a husband's heartbeat used to be. The driver, a man whose pity was as plain as the grime on his face, refused her last few dollars. He just shook his head, glanced at the skeletal structure behind her, and drove away, leaving her alone with the wind and the stone. The structure was generous to be called a barn. It was a ruin, a carcass of granite fieldstone picked clean by a century of neglect. The roof was a lattice of rotted timbers, open to a sky the color of old pewter. There were no doors, only gaping mouths that drank the ceaseless wind. The land itself was no better. It was what the locals called the spine, a ridge of bony earth where nothing much grew but stubborn scrub oak and thistle. Her late husband, Daniel, had bought it in a fit of romanticism years ago, charmed by a faded photograph and a slick salesman's pitch about unspoiled country. He had dreamed of building a summer home here. Now it was her only home, a monument to a dead dream in a dying season. She was 29 years old, a widow with empty pockets, standing before a pile of rocks that was, by law, her sanctuary. The wind was a physical thing on the spine. It was not a breeze or a gust. It was a current, a river of cold air that flowed from the northern mountains and scoured the landscape clean. It argued with the corners of the stone walls, creating a low, mournful music that vibrated through the soles of her worn boots. Ilara pulled her thin coat tighter, her gaze sweeping over the valley below. Smoke curled from the chimneys of the town of Northwood, nestled in a fold of the hills. It looked warm and impossibly distant, a different world. Here, on the hill, there was no comfort, only exposure. She felt like a lone, forgotten chess piece left on the board after the game was over. The game had been her life with Daniel. The board was this cold, indifferent earth. Her first night was spent not in the barn, but huddled against its leeward wall, wrapped in every blanket she owned. Sleep was a shallow, shivering affair, punctuated by the howling of the wind and the scuttling of unseen creatures in the stone. When dawn broke, a pale, watery light that offered no warmth, she felt a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. There was nothing left to lose. This realization was not a comfort, but a stripping away of all illusion. She was at the absolute floor of existence, and the only direction left was up, or to simply cease to be. For a long moment, staring at the unforgiving gray sky, she considered the latter. But then, a flicker of something else, something hard and stubborn that had been forged in the long nights of watching Daniel fade away, asserted itself. It was not hope. It was defiance. She spent the first week clearing rubble. Her hands, accustomed to the softness of a schoolteacher's life, were quickly blistered, then torn, then calloused. She worked with a methodical, unthinking rhythm, hauling stones from the interior of the barn and piling them against the most broken sections of the outer walls. It was mindless, back-breaking labor that quieted the grief. She could not think of Daniel when she was trying to lever a 200-pound slab of granite into place. She could only think of leverage, of balance, of the protest in her aching muscles. The townspeople, what few she saw from a distance, began to notice the lone figure toiling on the hill. A car would sometimes slow on the road below, its occupants staring up at the folly on the spine. She ignored them. Their world was not her world. After a week, a man in a dusty pickup truck rumbled up the rutted track to the barn. He was broad and weathered, with kind eyes set in a face that seemed to have been carved from the same stubborn oak as the trees on the hill. He introduced himself as Silas, her nearest neighbor from the farm in the valley. He carried a loaf of still warm bread and a jar of apple butter. He did not hide his concern. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low rumble. "Forgive me for intruding. But the folks in town, they're saying you mean to winter up here." He looked past her at the gaping roof and the piles of stone. "This place, it's a stone tomb. The winter on this hill ain't a joke. It'll kill you." Alara accepted the bread with a quiet thank you. She offered him nothing in return, for she had nothing. "I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Silas." Her voice was rough from disuse. He sighed, a plume of white vapor in the frigid air. "There's the church shelter in town. Or you could sell. Henderson down at the bank would probably give you a few hundred for the acreage, just to square it off his books. It's not much, but it'd get you a bus ticket south, somewhere warm." He was being practical, he was being kind. And in his kindness, she felt a sting of shame, the humiliation of being a project, a problem to be solved by sensible people. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "But I am staying." Silas looked at her, at the fierce, exhausted set of her jaw, and saw that arguing would be like reasoning with the wind itself. He nodded slowly, touched the brim of his cap, and retreated to his truck, leaving her with the scent of fresh bread and the heavy weight of his pity. The second visitor was not so kind. Mr. Henderson was a man whose softness was a form of armor. He was round and pink, his clean suit and polished shoes a stark insult to the gritty reality of the spine. He arrived in a gleaming black automobile that struggled up the track, its engine whining in protest. He did not get out of the car, but summoned her with a wave of a fleshy hand. "My dear woman," he began, his voice oozing a predatory sympathy that made her skin crawl. "Silas tells me you're attempting to make a go of it up here. A noble, but, if you'll forgive me, deeply misguided effort." He gestured vaguely at the barn. "This property is a liability, not an asset. It has been on the county's demolition list for a decade. I am prepared, out of respect for your late husband's memory and your delicate situation, to offer you $500. Cash. I'll take the land off your hands, and you can be on a train to a more hospitable climate by nightfall." The offer was an insult wrapped in the language of charity. $500 for 5 acres. He saw her not as a person but as a final piece of paperwork in the acquisition of Daniel's Folly. He saw a desperate woman he could easily exploit. The defiance inside her, the hard little kernel that had kept her going, burned hot and bright. "No, thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice colder than the wind. He chuckled, a condescending little sound. "Don't be a fool, child. What do you think you're going to do? Live in that? By Christmas, they'll be finding your frozen body in the snow. Take the money. It's my final offer." He saw the look in her eyes then, a flat, unyielding rejection that his money and influence could not penetrate. His smile vanished. "Have it your way," he snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. "But when you come crawling to me in a month, frostbitten and starving, the offer will be 200, if that." He signaled his driver, and the black car churned its way back down the hill, leaving behind the smell of exhaust and contempt. The encounter with Henderson solidified her resolve. Her survival was no longer just a matter of necessity. It was an act of rebellion. She would not be the tragic fool of his narrative. She would not be broken. But how? Silas was right. Henderson, for all his malice, was also right. The barn was a stone tomb. A furnace big enough to heat such a space would consume a forest of wood, and she had neither the furnace nor the forest. Despair, a familiar and unwelcome guest, settled over her again. She retreated into the deepest part of the barn, a section where all 4 walls were still mostly intact, seeking shelter from the relentless wind. She sat on a pile of rubble, her head in her hands, the cold seeping into her bones. This was it. This was the end of the line. She had tried. She had failed. It was in that moment of absolute surrender that she noticed it. The silence. The wind still shrieked outside, a high, thin scream. But here, in the core of the ruin, it was muffled. The stone walls, 3 feet thick in places, were a buffer. It was still cold, bitterly so, but the savage, biting edge of the wind was gone, and there was something else. A scent. The smell of damp earth, clean and ancient. She followed it to a corner where the floor had collapsed, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. A root cellar. Daniel's deed had mentioned it. She found a splinter of wood, lit it with one of her precious matches, and descended. The air grew stiller with each step down. The flame of her makeshift torch, which had danced wildly above, barely flickered now. 10 feet below the ground, she stepped onto an earthen floor, and she felt it, a distinct and undeniable change in temperature. It was not warm, not by any stretch of the imagination, but the biting, aggressive cold of the surface world was gone. Here, in the belly of the earth, the chill was passive, constant, and profoundly different. It was the difference between being stabbed with an icicle and holding a cool stone. She pressed her bare hand against the packed dirt wall. It was cool, yes, but it felt alive. It held a latent, neutral energy. And then, a memory surfaced, as clear as if it were spoken in her ear. Her grandmother, a woman from the old country with hands as gnarled as apple roots, standing in her own cellar surrounded by jars of preserves. "The earth remembers," her grandmother had said, her voice thick with an accent Alara had loved. "In summer it remembers the winter cold. In winter it holds the memory of the summer sun. It is slow. It is patient. You don't fight the earth, child. You ask for its help. You build with it, not on it." At the time, they had been the ramblings of an old woman. Now, standing in the dark heart of the stone barn, they were a blueprint. The idea that bloomed in that cellar was so radical, so contrary to everything she knew about houses and heat, that she almost laughed at its audacity. She would not try to heat the entire barn. That was Henderson's way of thinking, Silas's way of thinking. Brute force. A bigger furnace. More wood. She would do what her grandmother had said. She would ask the earth for help. She would build a house inside the house. A small, hyper-insulated cabin. A cocoon nestled within the protective stone shell of the barn. The barn would not be her home. It would be the first layer of her coat. Its massive stone walls would block the wind and, she hoped, act as a thermal battery, absorbing any heat from the low winter sun and radiating it slowly inward. The primary source of heat, however, would come from below, the constant stable temperature of the deep earth. Her plan was to build her small living chamber directly over the mouth of the root cellar. The chamber itself would be tiny, no more than 10 by 12 feet, just big enough for a bed, a table, and a stove. She would use the lumber she could salvage from the collapsed roof and buy insulation, thick bats of it, with the last of her money. She would install a small, efficient wood stove, not a monster meant to fight the cold, but a small one designed to provide a gentle, constant source of warmth. The goal was not to create a pocket of summer in the middle of winter, but to maintain a livable, stable temperature, letting the combined forces of the Earth's thermal mass, the sun's radiation on the stone, and the small stove work in concert. It was a gamble on a dead woman's folk wisdom against the hard physics of a northern winter. The work that followed was a blur of focused, desperate energy. She sold Daniel's gold watch, the last sentimental thing she owned, in a town 50 miles away where no one knew her. The $200 it fetched was a fortune. It bought her rolls of thick wool insulation, a small cast-iron stove, a triple-paned window, and boxes of nails and screws. The rest she scavenged. She tore down the most unstable sections of the roof, carefully salvaging every usable plank and beam. She learned the heft and balance of a hammer, the satisfying bite of a sharp saw. She framed her small house, a box of pale, new wood rising like a strange altar in the center of the gray stone ruin. Silas watched her progress from his fields, his expression shifting from pity to bewilderment. He saw her framing the tiny structure and shook his head, certain she had finally lost her mind. Why would anyone build a shed inside a ruin? One day he couldn't contain his curiosity any longer and came up the hill again. He found her wrestling a heavy, salvaged window into place. "Alara," he said, foregoing any formality, "what in God's name are you building?" She paused, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold, and explained her theory. She spoke of thermal mass, of the Earth's stable temperature, of the barn acting as a windbreak and a heat sink. He listened patiently, his brow furrowed. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. "That's not how it's done," he said finally. It was not a criticism, but a simple statement of fact. "You fight a winter here with fire and thick walls. A big fire, that little stove." He gestured to the cast iron box sitting nearby. "That won't keep a cup of coffee warm when the north wind blows." He pointed to her insulation. "That stuff is good, but it can't make heat where there is none. You're building a fine-looking box, I'll give you that. But it's a cold box. An ice box." She simply nodded. "Maybe," she said. "But it's the only plan I have." Her quiet certainty unsettled him. It wasn't the certainty of knowledge, but the certainty of someone with no other choice. He left that day feeling a new emotion toward her. Not pity, not bewilderment, but a strange and profound unease. The rumors in town, fanned by Henderson, grew more elaborate. She was the barn witch, consorting with spirits on the hill. She was a mad woman, the mole woman, digging her own grave. People who had once felt a measure of sympathy now looked upon her project with scorn and a touch of fear. Her refusal to conform to the narrative of the helpless widow was an affront. She was supposed to fail quietly, to accept charity, to disappear. Instead, she was stubbornly, visibly, insanely building. Henderson made a public show of it at the general store. "I tried to help her," he'd say, his voice dripping with false concern. "Offered her a fair price, but she's touched in the head. Sad business. The county will have to deal with her soon enough." Alara was oblivious to most of it. Her world had shrunk to the 10 by 12 foot frame, to the feel of wood and stone, to the race against the coming snow. She finished the interior walls and stuffed them with insulation until they bulged. She sheathed the outside in thick planks. She installed the triple-paned window on the south-facing wall, where it would catch the most of the meager winter sun. Her greatest challenge was the roof. She built a shallow pitched roof for her inner house, then laid heavy timbers across the top of the barn's stone walls above it, creating a secondary rough roof over the entire central section. On this, she piled layers of salvaged corrugated tin, tar paper, and finally, thick sod she cut from the leeward side of the hill. It was an ugly, patchwork creation, but she hoped it would keep the worst of the snow out of the space between her inner and outer walls. Her final task was the stove. She carefully installed the small cast-iron stove, running the insulated pipe up through her ceiling, and then angling it out through a gap in the stone wall high above. It was a small black heart for her wooden cocoon. The first time she lit a fire in it, the little stove drew perfectly, the smoke puffing cleanly out the chimney. She closed the door to her small chamber and sat on the floor, feeling the air begin to change. It was a slow, subtle transformation. The stove did not blast heat. It radiated it, a gentle, penetrating warmth that seemed to be absorbed by the wood and insulation around her. An hour later, the outside temperature was hovering near freezing, but inside her box, it was a comfortable 55 degrees. It was not warm, but it was the absence of cold. It was enough. The first snows came in late November, a light dusting that outlined the world in white, The townspeople nodded knowingly. This was the beginning of the end for the madwoman on the hill, but the small plume of smoke continued to rise from the barn. December brought deeper cold. The ground froze solid. The wind developed a new, sharper edge. Ilara's days fell into a simple, monastic rhythm. Wake, tend the fire, eat a spare meal of oats or beans, work on sealing the gaps in the outer stone walls with a mortar of clay and straw, read by lamplight, sleep. Her little stove consumed a surprisingly small amount of wood. A single log would burn for hours, its heat held captive by the insulated walls. The south-facing window, on the rare sunny days, allowed a rectangle of pale light to fall on the floor, and she could feel a distinct warmth in that spot. Her system was working. It was a fragile, unproven success, but it was working. Silas would see her sometimes, a small figure moving against the snow, gathering fallen branches from the scrub oaks. He had laid in his winter supply of wood months ago, a massive stack of split cordwood that stood taller than he did. He looked at his stack, then at the pathetic little pile she was accumulating, and he would shake his head. He had insulated his own farmhouse, installed storm windows, and cleaned his furnace, a massive iron beast in the basement that devoured logs like a hungry god. He had done everything the right way, the sensible way. Yet he could not shake the image of her, toiling alone, guided by some strange ancestral logic he could not comprehend. In the second week of January, the sky changed. The familiar pewter gray deepened to a bruised purple. The wind died down to an eerie stillness. The air grew heavy, expectant. The old-timers in town looked at the sky and fell silent. They recognized the signs. This was not a storm. This was a reckoning. The radio began broadcasting warnings of a historic blizzard, an Arctic clipper of unprecedented size and ferocity descending from the pole. People rushed to the store, clearing the shelves of bread, batteries, and canned goods. There was a nervous, frantic energy in the air. Henderson was heard boasting that his new generator and propane heating system could withstand anything. The first flakes began to fall at dusk. They were not soft, gentle flakes, but hard, granular pellets, driven by a rising wind. By nightfall, the world had vanished into a screaming vortex of white. The wind did not howl. It shrieked, a solid wall of sound that seemed to want to tear the world from its foundations. The temperature plummeted. 10 below, 20 below, 30 below zero. It was a cold that was actively hostile, a cold that felt like a living entity. Inside her cocoon, Ilara felt the storm arrive. The barn groaned around her. The wind found every crack in the old stone walls, and she could hear it whistling and moaning in the buffer zone between her inner chamber and the outer shell. It was a terrifying sound, the sound of a world being torn apart. But inside her 10 by 12-foot room, it was calm. The flame in the stove flickered slightly as a powerful gust found its way down the chimney pipe, but it held steady. The air temperature, which had been a stable 55, dropped a few degrees, but then held. She added another small log to the fire and sat at her table, listening. The thick stone walls of the barn were taking the full force of the blizzard's fury, acting as a massive breakwater against a frozen sea. Her small, insulated ark floated in the calm harbor they created. In the town, chaos reigned. The power lines, heavy with ice and lashed by the wind, snapped first. The town was plunged into darkness and a sudden, shocking cold. Backup generators kicked on in some houses, only to fail as their fuel lines froze. Henderson's state-of-the-art propane system sputtered and died, the liquid fuel turning to sludge in the tank. Pipes froze, then burst, flooding basements with water that quickly turned to solid ice. The modern, well-built houses, designed to rely on constant, powerful heating systems, became frigid traps. Their large windows, which were so pleasant in the summer, now radiated cold into the rooms, sucking out what little warmth remained. At his farm, Silas fought a desperate battle. His furnace, a monument to traditional brute force, was roaring, consuming logs at an alarming rate. Yet the farmhouse was cold. A layer of frost was creeping across the inside of his windows. The wind rattled the storm sashes and forced icy drafts through every tiny gap. He and his wife huddled with their children in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, wrapped in blankets, feeding the hungry stove. By the second day of the storm, Silas looked at his woodpile with a growing sense of dread. It was half gone. At this rate, they would not last another day. He looked out the window at the white fury, and then his eyes were drawn, as they so often were, to the hill. Through the swirling snow he thought he saw it, a thin, unwavering line of gray smoke rising from the ruin on the spine. It seemed impossible. It had to be a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by cold and fear. But it was steady. A calm, quiet breath in the heart of the hurricane. Desperation made him a believer. Or at least it made him willing to investigate a miracle. Leaving his wife with a stern warning to make the wood last, he bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, pulled goggles over his eyes, and stepped out into the blizzard. The force of the wind knocked him to his knees. It was like trying to walk through a solid object. He fought his way to his barn, grabbed a coil of rope, tied one end to the barn door and the other around his waist, and began the trek to Alara's property, a journey of a few hundred yards that felt like an Arctic expedition. The snow was waist-deep, the wind driving it into his clothes and freezing on his skin. He navigated by memory, his world reduced to a maelstrom of white. He almost missed the barn, a looming gray shadow that materialized suddenly out of the blizzard. He stumbled toward the main opening, the one he knew faced away from the wind. Pushing through a deep drift of snow, he half fell into the ruin. The transition was instantaneous and shocking. The screaming of the wind dropped to a muffled roar. The air, while still brutally cold, was still. He was out of the current. He stood for a moment, his lungs burning, his body shaking, and let his eyes adjust to the gloom. He saw her inner structure, a pale box in the center of the space. A faint yellow light glowed in its single window. He stumbled towards it, his frozen hands fumbling for a door. He found a simple wooden latch and pushed the door open. He was met not with a blast of heat, but with a wave of gentle, pervasive warmth. It was not the dry, scorching heat of his own furnace. It was a soft, humid warmth that felt like a living thing. Alara was sitting at her small table, a book open in the light of a kerosene lamp. She looked up, startled but not frightened. The room was small, simple, and impossibly, serenely comfortable. The little stove in the corner glowed with a dull red heat, a small log smoldering inside. There was no frost on her window. The air smelled of wood smoke and drying wool. Silas just stood there, snow-caked and trembling, a refugee from a frozen war who had just stumbled into a pocket of inexplicable peace. "Silas," she said, her voice calm. "Come in. You must be frozen." He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him. He was too stunned to speak. He looked around the small space, at the insulated walls, the sturdy ceiling, the faint warmth rising from the floorboards over the cellar. He looked at the tiny stove, a toy compared to his iron monster, and then back at her. "How?" He finally managed to rasp, his voice hoarse. "My furnace. It's eating the woodpile alive, and my house is still freezing. This place, it should be a block of ice." She poured him a cup of hot tea from a kettle on the stove. "The barn is doing most of the work," she explained, her voice simple and direct, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. "It stops the wind. The stone holds what little heat the sun gives, and the ground underneath us is always the same temperature. The stove doesn't have to fight the whole winter. It only has to warm this little room." She tapped the insulated wall. "And these walls hold the warmth in. It's not about making a big fire. It's about not letting the warmth escape. He drank the tea, the heat spreading through his frozen core. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a pitiful widow or a madwoman, but as someone who possessed a kind of wisdom he could not fathom. She had not fought the winter. She had outsmarted it. She had bent its rules to her own survival. He, with his big house and his big furnace and his mountain of wood, had been the fool. "I'll be damned," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "We all called you crazy. Every last one of us." He looked down into his cup. "We were wrong." The blizzard raged for another full day. Silas stayed in the barn, his presence a silent testament to her vindication. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, the world was transformed. It was a landscape of impossible sculptural beauty and utter devastation. Snowdrifts were piled to the rooftops. The town was silent and frozen. When Silas returned to his farm, he found his family safe but shivering, the last of the wood gone. The stories that emerged in the following days were grim. Frozen pipes had ruined half the homes in town. Henderson's grand house was an uninhabitable wreck, its plumbing system destroyed. Several older residents had to be rescued, suffering from severe hypothermia. The town was crippled. But the story that eclipsed all others was the one Silas told. He told it first to his wife, then to his neighbors, then at the emergency meeting in the town hall. He told them about walking into the barn and finding not a tomb, but a sanctuary. He described the gentle, steady warmth, the tiny stove, the quiet calm at the heart of the storm. People listened with stunned disbelief, which slowly gave way to a dawning awe. The barn witch, the mole woman, had not just survived. She had thrived. The perception of Alara shifted overnight. Mockery turned to respect. Scorn turned to reverence. People began making the trek up the hill, not to gawk, but to learn. They came with questions, their practical, conventional certainties shattered by the blizzard. They looked at her house within a house, touched the insulated walls, and felt the quiet warmth rising from the floor. Alara, who had been an outcast, found herself becoming a teacher again. She explained the principles to them, the simple ancient logic of working with the landscape instead of against it. Henderson, his fortune diminished, and his reputation in tatters, quietly sold his holdings and moved away, unable to bear the silent judgment in the eyes of the townsfolk, who now looked to the woman on the hill for guidance. Silas became her first and most devoted student. Together they refined the design, combining her intuitive knowledge with his practical skills. They called it the Spine Method. The following summer, he helped his neighbors build their own versions, retrofitting old barns and sheds, building small super-insulated cores within larger, unheated structures. The idea spread, a piece of folk wisdom reborn out of necessity. The houses were not pretty, but they were resilient. They were warm. They worked. Alara never sought payment, but her woodshed was always mysteriously full, her pantry stocked with jars of preserves and smoked meats left on her doorstep. She was no longer alone, but the quiet, respected heart of a community she had inadvertently remade. Years passed. The scars of the great blizzard faded from the landscape, but not from the memory of the people. The Spine Method became the regional standard for new construction, a testament to its efficiency and durability. Alara lived out her days in the stone barn, in the small, warm room she had built with her own hands. She never remarried, finding a quiet contentment in her solitude, a solitude now buffered by the respect and friendship of the community that had once scorned her. Children who had been told stories of the barn witch now grew up hearing tales of Alara the Wise, the woman who listened to the earth. The story of the woman who moved into a stone barn became a local legend, a parable told on cold winter nights. It served as a reminder that what looks like folly from a distance can sometimes be the deepest form of wisdom. It was a story about the vast difference between fighting the world and finding one's place within it. True strength, the story concluded, was not always found in the grand gesture or the roaring fire. Sometimes it was in the quiet, stubborn act of building a small, warm space in a cold, unforgiving world, and having the courage to trust in a wisdom that the world has forgotten how to hear.